thank the speaker and the members of the legislature for providing this forum, and more importantly, the Bank of Guam for providing the luncheon. So can we just give a round of applause to the members of the legislature and the Bank of Guam for feeding us. And for all of you who have come back and are here again, thank you for just joining us in this afternoon session. The afternoon session is different in its forum, that we are going to be challenged by 4 brilliant minds, and that's always interesting. So I want to welcome the members of the panel for our afternoon session. Hope, would you like to introduce the first one? I believe that we were told to go from left to right. Is that the order? Okay, everybody. Well, I just want, I don't want anybody taking me to court if you don't agree over there. So
we start with the senior citizens.
We start with the most senior. No, and I mean that. No, I mean that in all due respect, because he was a political activist, and seniors do bring a wealth of experience. Now, come on, take that all back, okay? All right. So he will lead the other younger members of the panel in this discussion. So I will stand on what I just said about the most senior, notable, Honorable Benjamin J.F. Cruz, and it's an honor for me and a privilege to introduce him. In 1975, BJ earned a law degree at Santa Clara University and later served in several capacities in the Governor Ricardo J. Bordallo administrations, including legal counsel, and later as the governor's liaison to the White House, the Congress, and the National Governors Association in Washington, D.C. In 1984, Bordallo appointed BJ as judge in the Superior Court of Guam at age 33. The youngest attorney ever appointed to that position. Now, panel members?
No, he was 23.
Oh, I'm sorry, they made an error. I believe he was only 23. Okay, the youngest attorney ever appointed to that position. He later retired as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Guam. In 2004, BJ, as we all know him and call him and would like to be addressed as BJ, was elected to the Guam Legislature, where he currently serves as Vice Speaker. BJ is often observed in firm composure at legislative oversight hearings, sometimes, where he often asks tough questions that demand clear answers, and you're going to see him make some tough statements this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our Honorable Justice Benjamin J.F. Cruz.
Thank you very much. This is the one time that I'm glad that it's age before beauty, because I was in my office panicking, thinking that I was going to have to speak after Robert and Julian. And I was trying to figure out if I could have a heart attack or something so that I wouldn't have to come back out here and speak after Julian. So I was glad that, because if you've seen him speak, if you've heard him speak, he is an absolutely brilliant and passionate speaker. And I'm glad Therese and I exerted our seniority and asked to speak before him. But I hope most of you were here this morning, because it's imperative that you get the background that Dr. Corbin provided as to the United Nations and Robert's historical analysis or recounting of things that happened. I was sitting there thinking that I'm a relic of history, because we've lived through all of it between myself, Robert, Marilyn, Hope, Ron. We were all there, and Ken in the back. He was even before us in the brown shirt movement. But those of us in the late 70s, when we incorporated OPIR, and when we incorporated Pada Pada and took on the two Judys on their on the constitutional, insisting that you had to establish status before you could write the Constitution. But just so I don't take up all the time, I think I'd just like to go back to emphasize what Dr. Corbin mentioned this morning, that this whole issue is based around two documents. The first document, as Robert recounted, was the Treaty of Paris of 1898, the ceding Guam to the United States, wherein in Article 9 of the Treaty of Paris it reads, quote, "The civil rights and political status of the native inhabitants of the territories hereby ceded in the United States shall be determined by Congress." And Robert made that emphasis this morning in his presentation. And Dr. Corbin, in his recantation of all of the United Nations things, I think the one thing that should be stressed is the United Nations Charter, Chapter 9, Article 73, which reads, quote, "Members of the United Nations which have or assume responsibilities for the administration of territories whose peoples have not yet attained a full measure of self-government recognize the principle that the interests of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount and accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within the system of international peace and security established by these present charter the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories, and to this end to develop self-government, to take due account of the political aspirations of the people, and to assist them in the progressive development of free political institutions according to the particular circumstances of each territory and its peoples and their varying stages of advancement." And that's from which these two documents are the basis of this whole discussion of why we in OPI believe that there is an inherent indigenous human right, and as Robert put it, last he checked, we as Chamorros are human, and so it's a basic human right, the right of self-determination inures to the people. And the one place where I differ with the law and some of the scholars in the issue is that I really don't believe that it should be tied back to the Organic Act. I think more correctly, it should be back to the Treaty of Paris, because it was the Treaty of Paris in 1898 that said that the United States and the United States Congress had an obligation to the native inhabitants of the island to assure their political development. And if we take it back, and I know Julian will talk about this more later about the fact that it's not race-based, if we take it back to 1898, I can assure you that my great-grandfather, who was fresh off the boat, a Chinese whaler, who had 26 children, that they had that the right of, they weren't all Chamorro children. They were half Chinese and the other half were Chamorros. Other half are half and half Chinese and Chamorros. So it's not race-based. It was those who can claim that they were here in 1898. And I think Julian will explain it more in his treatise about the fact that it's not race-based and that there are other issues that can be addressed. My position today that I was asked to talk about was an article that I wrote in 1987. This thing has been going since forever. It was interesting last night after I went to the Mass for St. Jude Mass for elected leaders. I stopped by the office to brush my teeth because I was going to go to another party. And the phone rang, and I thought it was Roy calling me to say, let's carpool. I picked it up, and it was Captain Peter Santos from Afghanistan. He was calling me long distance to say that he was very proud about the fact that the local leaders are starting to address this issue, and I decided I would correct him and inform him that we were doing this about the same time that he was born. And I wasn't very far off. He was born in 1974. We formed Opie in about 77, and Pada in 79. And so we'd been around a long time when he was still in Pampers that we were fighting this fight. And so I wanted to correct that. And in 1987, I was asked to come take off my robe as a judge and come back out to assist in the educational process that was being conducted at that time for the Commonwealth Act that was before the people at that time. And I wanted to address the one issue specific to whether or not it was unconstitutional to limit the vote to indigenous people. And indigenous, by definition, would be those that could claim their ancestry to either 1950 for some under the current law, or those of us that believe that it should be indigenous who can claim their ancestry to 1898. One of the other reasons why I wanted to take it back to 1898 was because between 1898 and 1950, a lot of Chamorros became U.S. citizens, and so therefore did not become U.S. citizens by virtue of the Organic Act. And if one was to be strict about the interpretation of citizenship by virtue of the Organic Act, that those individuals, the Underwoods and a couple of the others, would probably be precluded because they had received their citizenship by virtue of the fact that their father or their grandfather had, by marriage, provided them with their citizenship, or for some of other people who's like my grandfather, who was in the Navy in the 1920s, and fortunately he didn't get his citizenship until 1950. But those who were in the military during and before the war and got their citizenship, they can't claim their citizenship by virtue of the Organic Act. So they would be precluded from the participation in this plebiscite and also in the Chamorro Land Trust. So I think more correctly we've got to address it and take it back to 1898 and the promise that was made to those people that were on the island at that time. I also wanted to, in the paper that I published in 1987, debunk the myth that it was unconstitutional to limit, that it was unconstitutional to deny people the right to vote if they were U.S. citizens. And my hypothesis was the United States history is replete with instances where U.S. citizens are denied the right to vote. And when the Constitution was first passed and the first elections were done, it was only done by white males and white males who owned property. It wasn't just all the white males, it was only white males that owned property. 50% or more of the population was made up of women, but women were not allowed to vote for the first 130 years of the country. Yeah, the next time that and so for that period, there was a whole group of American citizens who were not allowed to vote, the women and men who didn't have property, white or black. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, and that then included former slaves, the males, because still women were still not going to be given the right to vote, even with the 15th Amendment. And so even as late as 1870, there was still, women were not allowed to vote, and you had men with property regardless of race or color. Then the next one was in 1920 when women's suffrage was finally passed as an amendment. And that was near 130, 140 years after the founding of the country that women were finally recognized and given the equal right to vote. So the Americans can't claim that U.S. citizenship guaranteed a vote. Even with the passage of the 19th Amendment, there were still thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of U.S. citizens who still were not allowed to vote. And the most egregious of that group, the most evident of that group, were the thousands and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, that lived in the District of Columbia, the seat of government for the United States of America. Those U.S. citizens that lived in the District of Columbia between 1770 and 1961 could not vote in the presidential election. They were precluded from voting. It took an amendment to the Constitution, the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, to allow the men and women living in the District of Columbia the right to vote in a presidential election. But it took a constitutional amendment. It wasn't sufficient to be able to pass a law by the U.S. Congress. It had to be a constitutional amendment. And the reason why it needed to be a constitutional amendment was because people seem to forget that the right to vote for president does not inure to each U.S. citizen individually. The right to vote for the president is vested in members who we elect to the Electoral College. I think some of us saw that in 2000 when Al Gore got the popular vote, but George Bush won the presidency, because when it came down to the issue of which states did George Bush win as opposed to which states did Al Gore win, the number of electoral votes that went to George Bush, especially with what the U.S. Supreme Court did with the state of Florida, gave him the majority of the votes and therefore the presidency of the United States. So it's never been an individual right. There's been talk, and people are still complaining even to this day. They're still trying to figure out, there's a proposal to try to have direct voting for the president, but that is still not the law of the land. The law of the land is still, under the original Constitution, Electoral College members are elected, and they're the ones that determine who's going to be the president of the United States. And they don't, some of them, in some of the states, don't even have to follow what the popular vote was in their states. If they're elected as members of the Electoral College, they could, and some of them have actually voted against the popular vote in their state. Even with the passage of the 23rd Amendment, there still were a lot of people that were precluded or prevented from voting because there were poll taxes, and therefore there was a financial, not so much a prohibition, but an inhibition that prevented people from voting because they couldn't afford to pay the poll tax. So consequently, the Congress and two-thirds of the states had to pass the 24th Amendment, which abolished poll taxes, so that it didn't matter whether or not you were a landowner or whether you had the money to pay for the poll tax. You could vote if you were a U.S. citizen and lived in a state. Even with that, there was still a lot of people that weren't allowed to vote. It wasn't until 1971 that the 26th Amendment was passed, giving the vote to 18-year-olds. Prior to that, it was 21-year-olds, and it wasn't until 1971, 40 years ago, that we gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. So the history of the United States is replete with examples of exclusions of people in spite of the fact of their U.S. citizenship from being able to vote. But even with that, there was still one other group that had to be addressed, and those were the overseas citizens. And the only way to be able to address that was the passage in 1975 of the Overseas Voting Rights Act, OCVRA, Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act of 1975. In that act, it was determined that you could vote for President of the United States if you were living even if you were living in a foreign country, as long as you could trace your residency back to a state. That if you were born and were raised in Idaho, and you went to University of Idaho and then decided afterwards that you were going to move to Spain to teach English or to teach at a university, you could vote for the President of the United States, and you would get your your absentee ballot from the state of Idaho, because you could trace your residency back to the state of Idaho, and or whatever state that you come from. As a result of the Voting Rights Act, the OCVRA of 1975, Elizabeth Barrett Anderson, when she was the Attorney General of Guam, had a group of her attorneys bring an action in the Ninth Circuit District Court to challenge the fact that all the voters in Guam were denied the right to vote for the presidency. And it was the Attorney General of the Territory of Guam, on behalf of all U.S. citizens residing on Guam qualified to vote pursuant to the Organic Act et al. Versus the United States of America. And in that case, the Ninth Circuit issued a ruling which wasn't really affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court, but in their refusal to take the case up on appeal, it's deemed to have been supported or tacitly agreed to by the U.S. Supreme Court, in that they didn't deem it important enough to take it up on appeal and rule on it. But that was the last word. In that, the problem with that case, and I would really encourage everybody to find that case. It's a 1987 or 1988 case, 86 or 87 case. To read that, because when the Ninth Circuit dismissed the case, it dismissed it because of a real interesting technicality. At the very end of the opinion, it reads, "Plaintiff's claim in this case is asserted on behalf of all voters who vote in Guam elections. It is not a claim on behalf of those who have previously qualified to vote in a state election. The OCVRA does not evidence Congress's ability or intent to permit all voters in Guam elections to vote in presidential elections." So from that, it is saying that those of us even, that grew up in the States and attended college in the States and had the opportunity to vote back in the States, if we could trace our residency to one of the states, we could apply for a absentee ballot from the state of California, from where I graduated from college and law school. I could apply to the state of California for an absentee ballot and vote for the presidency, for the President of the United States, because I can trace my voting right to the state of California. I was very careful about not voting in California when I was going to school, because Melvin and I had decided it was time. I couldn't vote in California, because if I wanted to come back to Guam and run for office, I didn't want to be precluded by having anybody say that I had voted in the California election and had given up my residency on Guam. I had always considered Guam eventually to be my domicile and my residence. So though I may have campaigned for individuals in the elections while I was in school, I made sure that I did not vote because of the fact that I wanted to maintain my voting rights here on Guam. But had I done so, I believe that I could, even to this day, continue to ask for voting for an absentee ballot to vote for the President of the United States. But the problem with the Attorney General's case that they brought on behalf of all, and I stress the word all, because in the opinion of the court, they stressed that issue, all, and followed with the line, "It is not a claim on behalf of those who have previously qualified to vote in state elections." So even with that, there's still a whole group of American citizens, U.S. citizens, who are denied the right to vote because of where they're at, the land on which they're standing, living. And so the thing is that the Electoral College, the right to vote is the right given to the state. And the right given to the state is exercised by the Electoral College members who vote for the presidency. And it's they who will go to Washington the first week in January and cast the votes on behalf of their state as a result of the election in their state. But the history is replete with, there were times, I think, in Andrew Jackson's term where there was question of some of the electors got to Washington and decided they weren't going to vote for Andrew Jackson or whoever it was that was running against him at the time, because that was the right of the electors, the members of the Electoral College. And so the right to vote can be restricted, and it is my contention that there is no constitutional right to vote because of your U.S. citizenship, inasmuch as the United States in the past 150 years, 250 years, has shown that the Constitution and the laws of the United States can exclude citizens, and it is also my contention that under the Treaty of Paris and the United Nations Charter and the responsibility given to the Congress to protect and exercise the rights of the citizens of the native inhabitants of Guam, that they can and should, when and if, as Robert put it, if they decide that they're going to do something about addressing the plebiscite and the right of self-determination of the people, they can limit the vote. And I'm insistent that the right or the obligation to exercise the right was given to the people who were here in 1898 and their descendants. I'll leave it at that. I know my article had two other examples at the end, but that one is cultural and one is corporate, and rather than complicate the thing, I'll just stick with what the issue is before us, and just point out that there is precedence for denying the right to vote to U.S. citizens, and it would not be unconstitutional to have this vote and restrict it to the descendants who can trace their lineage to to those who were here on Guam in 1898. I think I'll stop at that and allow them to speak.
Sidzus Masi, Justice and Senator BJ Cruz. Our next speaker is Unu na Nona Guinigi Interu Itanota no si Therese, Attorney Therese Terlaje. Si Therese is a 1989 graduate of the UCLA School of Law and is licensed to practice law in Guam and California. She received her undergraduate degree in biology from Creighton University in Nebraska. In the past 20 years as a sole practitioner or partner in law firms, she has represented the diverse sectors of our community, including senior citizens, women and families, landowners, and business enterprises. Por favor, welcome si Therese Terlaje. Sidzus Masi. Therese, you can put.
I'd like to greet and acknowledge that I am in the presence of very distinguished members of our community. Many of you have been elected to office and have served our quest for self-determination with dignity, wisdom, courage, and excellence, and have by their actions inspired the aspirations of my generation. I'm humbled to be allowed by the Speaker, members of the 31st Guam Legislature, to make a presentation to those who've actually been in negotiations on our behalf or who have helped to get our leaders to the table by their diligent vocalization of the injustices. It's very impossible for me to be more eloquent or entertaining, dynamic than the other speakers today, and that will follow me, I'm sure. I appreciate very much your indulgence in my humble effort to revitalize these endeavors. Thank you. The impacts of historical injustices continue to plague the standard of living on Guam. The quality of life of the people, it's manifested in medical, economic, environmental, political aspects. The delay and denial of justice for inhabitants of Guam has impeded past efforts to achieve sustainable economy for Guam following World War II, and to achieve, and to this day, I believe, contribute to an identity crisis in our children, and an overall crisis in families and in our government. Guam must urgently strive for justice through political self-determination that incorporates a voice and authority to negate or halt standard of living impacts from carte blanche military expansion and other federal plans for Guam, and from the negative consequences of blanket or unstudied imposition of U.S. laws on Guam. Without justice, sustainability will elude Guam. And without sustained efforts, our justice will elude all of our people. In addition to the pursuit through international channels, the U.S. court system, Guam's elected leaders, as they have in the past, must directly negotiate with the U.S. to reach binding improvements for political status and aggressively seek UN and U.S. endorsement of self-determination for the native inhabitants of Guam. Notwithstanding the other roles that the Organic Act places on our elected leaders, we trust our congressmen, our congresswomen, governors, and our senators to tirelessly advocate for change in status and to be our first line of defense against further injustice by the U.S. government on the people of Guam. Before the Organic Act, the Guam Congress served in an advisory capacity to the naval governors. They attempted to represent interests of the civilian inhabitants directly to the naval governors, who obviously had no problem addressing the needs of the military inhabitants of Guam. The inspiring words of the Guam Congress, including the walkout, have been preserved for us. They've been summarized for our convenience. The Guam Congress battled to move away from an all-powerful naval rule and the ability of a naval governor to single-handedly act against the desires of the people of Guam, especially in a time of peace. It's my personal belief that no student of Guam should graduate without the opportunity to be inspired by the eloquence, sincerity, and urgency in the pleas for justice by the members of the Guam Congress. Nor should they graduate without opportunity to be angered by the continued applicability of those pleas to today's situation. One of the results of their efforts is the current Guam Legislature. Yet even after the Organic Act, the Guam Legislature, the sole voice for the people of Guam, battled appointed governor and U.S. system, which allowed one person, one agency of the U.S. to dole out denied justice. The Guam Legislature continued its efforts for fairness and justice and eventually attained an elected governor. It's incumbent on every leader who now sits in an elected office, due to the efforts of those who went before us, to learn the passion, the strategies, and the sacrifice endured in these battles for justice, lest they mistakenly believe that they were meant to sit in office as facilitators of the U.S. efforts to control Guam. The elected governor and the non-voting delegate to the U.S. Congress allowed us to elect residents of Guam to join the Guam Legislature's voices in Guam's quest for justice from the U.S. and for a change in political status by exercising our right to self-determination. Notwithstanding the passage of the Organic Act, the task forces and commissions utilized the resources of the government of Guam in this quest, including the Guam Task Force on Political Status, the Commission on Political Status, the Guam Self-Determination Commission, and its Guam Commonwealth Draft Act processes, the current Guam Decolonization Commission. Each of these mechanisms extended beyond the governor alone, for Guam's quest has always been multi-pronged, multi-voiced approach to justice, thus unifying diverse efforts and ensuring roles for each and every citizen in this pursuit. Multiple voices strengthen the pursuit, our pursuit of political status by strengthening our negotiating position. Just as legislators send official requests via resolution to Congress and other U.S. officials, or enact into law measures of subtle, but more often outright resistance to colonialism. There have been many contributions from all in our society in pursuit of a change in political status. Many of you, especially the Chief Justice here, were part of the NGOs and occasionally the government officials who represented Guam's quest to UN and its committees for many years. Elected leaders, those appointed to commissions or task force, government workers, volunteers, all traveled around the island to village meetings, government meetings, pocket meetings, family meetings to discuss political status. They traveled sometimes at great expense to other countries around the U.S. in order to be heard by officials of the U.S. government. We are proud today of the growing record of official testimonies and of war survivors like Beatrice Elmsley, Tom Barcinas, of the unity and the message and eloquence of the Guam Commonwealth hearings, and many more occasions. In many instances, the community banded together to raise money to send these few representatives. Teachers, government agencies, and officials were enlisted in the education of students and all residents as to our rights and our quests. The Guam Legislature enacted laws mandating the teaching of Guam history, and for a while, the Organic Act of Guam. But the bulk of this education and preservation of our rights was done by private citizens, many of them landowners, anti-nuclear advocates, many other groups. Some were war survivors, but many were first and foremost proud Chamorros who were deemed activists by the media. It was the impatience of these activists that kept justice at the forefront and keep justice at the forefront of Guam's quest. We should dedicate entire days to celebrating the accomplishments, sacrifice, perseverance of Guam's own citizens in the pursuit of justice. Legislators have long understood and taken advantage of the great potential of the government of Guam, even under U.S. law, to resist the further imposition of injustices to which we are vulnerable while in a colonized status. Examples of what I call resistance legislation include, foremost, the repeated impaneling of status commissions comprised of individuals in the community and reps from all branches of government. The Chamorro Land Trust Act reserved a home for Chamorros in perpetuity. The legislature passed a law prohibiting the arrest of protesters by our local police. Law was passed mandating that excess federal property returned to the government of Guam be in turn transferred to the original landowners to right an injustice done by the U.S., not by the government of Guam. Prior legislators refused to be swayed by the potential monetary boost to the government that a different use of the land would bring. We too should stand firm against threats of economic doom and the lure of federal funds or contracts that have been used in all places where the colonial power wants easy access to resources. We must not forget it was the business interests who overthrew the independent kingdom of Hawaii, while the U.S. government silently stood by and then pounced once the dirty work was done. One final example, there are numerous examples, time constraints don't allow us to celebrate today, but one of the recent ones was the legislature not wanting to be coerced into signing a programmatic agreement, potentially contributing to the adverse effects on our historic and cultural sites, passed a bond to build a Guam museum. It's actually the Vice Speaker's bill. Guam Legislature passed a bond to build a Guam museum with its own money that would be able to tell its own history, not beholden to U.S. interpretation. Our museum particularly must be a source of resistance to colonialism. In contrast, the effectiveness of the government in the pursuit of change in political status is vulnerable to the distraction and inconsistency of special interests, derailed by the pursuit of narrow agendas for personal gain. We must all be extremely diligent to stay unified in the face of these competing and divisive agendas. We must be most diligent to ensure that no branch, no official, no agency of our local government is distracted into facilitating U.S. control or further injustices. The efforts of all agencies must be redirected at building our negotiating strength, and all executive orders, memorandums, or unwritten agendas of facilitation or increased federal authority should be rescinded. Perhaps our legislature and especially the public could benefit from a policy similar to one of the first policies issued by President Obama's Attorney General, announcing that he would not defend the denial of FOIA requests by government officials except in very limited circumstances. Federal dollars by the way of grants and loans have to be scrutinized and if appropriate, rejected, where they would usurp from Guam commitment to a U.S. agenda which further impedes Guam's self-determination efforts and hinders our negotiating strength. There are many examples of the strings attached and the late discoveries of their full implications that make it reasonable and critical that we be extra cautious. We all drive through Tizon and reminded of the airport's refusal to return ancestral land based on bond covenants and the subsequent lease of that land to commercial interests. We recall the DOD and officials at various government agencies secretly entering into non-disclosure agreements that prevented the Guam agency personnel from informing the legislature of preliminary EIS findings. Recently, media has congratulated the airport and port on their designations as special military institutions, and we've learned of the port's battle to maintain control over its master plan as a result. We must check the final settlement between the port and a private contractor who, pursuant to lease of the former shipyard from Gita, and contracts with the military sued for exemption from Port Authority control and tariffs. We hear of the potential for U.S. DOD control of ships and entry into Upper Harbor. We must be diligent that DOD-funded research and other programs in any of our institutions are consistent with Guam's priorities and basic socio-economic, political, and cultural development goals of the people of Guam. The military made it very clear when they proposed a massive expansion of activities and forces on Guam that they would do as they pleased, that they might take more land, that there would be adverse effects to the people of Guam. They also announced the few needs that were within the control of the government of Guam. Their need for fresh water, their need to give us their sewer and their trash to manage and dispose of properly, their need for massive amounts of H2 laborers to get their projects done according to their timetable. The community did its part through effective use of the EIS and Section 106 processes, public hearings, town hall meetings, rallies, responded with overwhelming opposition, with active comments, educational campaigns. Teachers, social workers, government agencies responded. Many legislators responded, and the legislature as a whole was in firm opposition. Yet the military did not need the consent of the community, had found a way around the legislature, and was even able to pit executive branch agencies against each other in battles for mitigation money. A potentially great negotiating opportunity resulted instead in the announcement of the creation of an entity that would consist of military and Guam agency personnel to facilitate and expedite the processing of military permits. They announced the PA, Programmatic Agreement, which purportedly gave them Guam's consent and the freedom to move forward despite the adverse impacts to our historical and cultural sites. They have moved forward with the fencing and clearing of miles of forest in Northwest Field, with the relocation and expansion of their dog kennels to avoid dog stress from construction noise on the upcoming projects. They've successfully directed DPW to use federal funds to prioritize construction of the bridges, crucial to the military road haul network, before any project strictly for the benefit of our local community. As a solution to a dump that was violating the Federal Clean Water Act by leaching contaminants into U.S. waters such as the Longfit River and Pago Bay. The dump was leaching contaminants into U.S. waters such as Longfit River and Pago Bay. They've most recently announced that Guam has agreed to take DOD trash, to fill a brand new landfill built by bond payments exacted from future generations, and to dispose of the leachate in the shores of Inarajan. Their work needs are met by the congressional lifting of the caps of the H2 visas that our governor will have sole authority to grant. Excuse me, just let me get this up. Guam has a plan identifying 11 additional water wells for Guam's growth. The U.S. requires 22 additional wells to meet its expansion. Our own CCU has agreed to allow U.S. to take its water from 22 additional wells for free before we address the wells needed for our own needs and stripping our community of the possibility of addressing our needs first, selling the excess to the military. Power and water, formerly in control of the legislature as part of the entire government of Guam, are run by independent boards, like many other autonomous agencies. A huge chunk of Guam's overall interests is being negotiated piecemeal, and we are vulnerable to the potential influence on these boards by businessmen who aim to do, or business interests who are doing business with the military or their contractors. Ironically, it's a local agency that also insists on federal EPA objection that Guam can handle the wastewater from additional H2 barracks. The U.S. kept the H2 barracks off their bases now washes its hands of adverse impacts to wastewater, healthcare, recreational facilities. There's been little opposition, and the TLUC has continued to grant variances. A hope for greater justice has been preserved for each of us by those visionaries, those with the gift of oratory, those writers, lawmakers, those artists and activists with courage and voice, and those citizens who took the time and made the sacrifice to learn their own history, their own plight, and to work together towards the solution. Anyone involved in negotiation will tell you that skills and motivation are important, but timing can dictate your success. We must continue to be prepared at all times and ensure that the next generation, those in college and high school, are prepared after us for any opportunity that we can create, perhaps the ideal opportunity. All of us must urgently fill many roles. We must all teach the pursuit of justice that's been ingrained in us. We must use our voices to comment, protest, write, create art, and even sue. We must support each other and celebrate our successes and stay focused on strengthening the pursuit of justice and our negotiating position for a change in status, but through very carefully selected means. By carefully selected means, we can cure the identity crisis of our youth, re-empower our women and families, restore the pursuit of justice as a goal of the community, paramount to the pursuit of individual, family, business, or single industry wealth. We can and must prepare ourselves and our youth to be able to lead the various groups necessary to continue or culminate this quest. I have no doubt leaders will emerge to continue this quest as time marches on. Even more critical than the emergence of leaders may be the support structure of critical first followers instilled with the courage of the actions that we take today, who will lend critical mass and direction to all those efforts. Our success at this moment in time need not be measured by whether we reach our ultimate destination in the next year or even decade. It may be measured by ensuring that we leave no impediments for the next generation's opportunity for success. Thank you.
Saludaho, Attorney Therese Terlaje, demasiado importante como illustration. Ifretsa ni kwentosmo otoma na masenti gi tota audience. I'm very proud of you. Hago hagan gohan. Thank you, Sizus Masi. I mean, it really was an enlightening presentation because I was sitting here and I was looking at Senator Hope and I was saying, wow, I mean, that's an illustration of several isolated works of the government leaders here continuing to protest of all these little fragmented impediments that keep coming to us. And so we really thank you for that. The next speaker is Attorney Leevin Camacho, and I'm very proud to be the one to introduce you. Leevin is a graduate of John F. Kennedy High School. He earned his bachelor's degree in English literature at the University of Washington and his law degree at Boston University. Leevin clerked at the Supreme Court of Guam and has been in private practice for over 5 years. He is a solo practitioner with experience in the areas of criminal defense, civil litigation, and appeals. Ay nahobencitosti lo demasiado fuerza de menta y testimonio. And so saludo Loki, Attorney Camacho. Thank you for being one of our panel discussion this afternoon.
Thank you. I feel like I'm at a talent show and I'm following two acts that sang the song that I was planning on singing better than I could have. So I'm glad I didn't prepare a presentation, otherwise I wouldn't have had anything to say after Therese and Vice Speaker Cruz and Dr. Underwood and Dr. Corbin earlier today. I guess when I was invited to come talk the last week or so, I've been asking friends and family if they think Guam is a colony. And the most frequent answer is no. And in my opinion, everyone in this room probably will say without hesitation that Guam is a colony. And it made me aware that one of the biggest threats to the decolonization movement is apathy. That people do not believe that Guam is a colony, and they believe that colonialism on Guam ended at various points along Guam history. Some people will cite to the grant of citizenship in 1950. Others will cite to being able to elect our governor. And my presentation is called The Fourth Branch. And what I wanted to do is just, if you look at Guam's government, and I work at the Supreme Court, in 2004, I'll begin with the judiciary branch, or the judicial branch. We were given a Supreme Court by Congress in the 70s, and that was ruled to infringe on Article 3 court, so the federal district court. So I believe in 1984, Congress gave us another opportunity to create a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally was convened, and it wasn't until 2004 that Congress named the Supreme Court of Guam the highest judicial authority on the island. In 1984, when Congress gave us a Supreme Court, they made it so that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals would oversee the jurisprudence on Guam for 15 years because they did not trust our local jurists to develop a body of law that would be consistent with U.S. law. And I've met many very intelligent Chamorros who've been licensed to practice law since the 60s, actually. Therese's father, I believe, in 1963, that he was licensed to practice law, Mr. Joaquin Arreola. So there are many lawyers on Guam, but yet in 1984, we're not talking that long ago, they did not believe that we had the ability to rule based on the law. Our legislature, the Guam Congress, did not have any authority, and it wasn't until 1950 that we were given the Guam Legislature. But of course, if you read the Organic Act, to this day, Congress has the explicit authority to annul any law that is passed on the island of Guam. For 20 years before we had our governor, we were given a civilian governor, and who had the ability to veto laws that were passed by the Guam Legislature. The Guam Legislature could override that veto by 2/3, similar to what we have today. But the catch was that the governor could then refer it to the President of the United States to override the override of the veto. And I believe that was exercised 4 times in Guam history. So you have a civilian governor who ultimately can go back to the President and say, I don't agree with what these people in the legislature are doing, can you please step in? And the President had the ability to say, fine, that law is null and void. If you look at the governor, again, we were given one in 1950. We were finally given an elected governor in 1970. And the point that I wanted to make in that talking about colonialism and using the word colony, it's not about, it's not a statement about what Guam is like right now. Because a lot of people think it's about poverty, it's about citizenship. It's really about the ability to govern yourself, and at least in my opinion. And the fact that our 3 branches of government are subservient to the United States Congress, that we are governed by a federal statute, that we have been held to be no more powerful than a federal instrumentality, is something that people on Guam need to know. And that in moving forward, it is not enough to educate on the 3 options of political status. People need to understand that our current political status is unacceptable, and it takes away power from the people who need to have it in our hands. And I mentioned the historical context, and there's a danger in saying that the piecemeal government that we've been given is adequate. Our territorial status, which was arrived at based on a $600 tariff on oranges being shipped from Puerto Rico to New York. That's where unincorporated territories came from. And if you read the insular cases, they're all about tariffs, right? So the political status of people living in Puerto Rico, living on Guam, living in the Philippines, living later in the Virgin Islands. All of that was arrived at based on whether or not shippers should have to pay taxes. We need to understand that the discrimination that the United States Congress is allowed to do under the insular cases in Article 4 inhibits us today. If you look at GMH and you look at Medicaid, Medicare, and the way that Congress can cap and explicitly discriminate against the territories and the effect that it has on the government of Guam and the people who live here, it is unacceptable. But again, it is something that most people are not aware of. There was a GAO report that was done, I believe, in 2004 at the request of Congresswoman Bordallo as well as other delegates. And if you read through it and you see that in a state of comparable socioeconomic status, they receive 12 times more in benefits per capita than the people of Guam do. And I believe that in talking of, I actually will keep my conversation brief, but you know, when I was talking to some friends about this, and I said, oh, my talk is called The Fourth Branch, and they said, oh, you mean the people of Guam? And I kind of laughed, but I thought that was a perfect way to illustrate the way that power should be moving, because colonialism is about power, and decolonization needs to be about power, and placing power in the right place. Thank you.
We would like at this point to request our speakers to provide a copy of their presentation. Your speeches will be made available so that and so will the entire session. This will also be on PBS, on the legislative channel today. So thank you. Wow, what presentations today. And we are streaming live on KUAM. Gosna banidosu sti nahaoni. I'm kind of taken aback and just so moved by these brilliant presentations today. Si manaizu no oportunidad para be sangan didi prestinam patgun para guahu sa sinya lahihu si Leevin, sinya lahihu si Julian, dan esti dos na celuhu si BJ dan si Therese. Si Therese como nana anak fanintizu ngezi sinangannya siya sa esti na tono contamination goes 3 kilo. Zahita, mumireresi todo ju siya na setnot I profan huzong. Zani famagoonta. The debidita ekungo kesti sinanganin niya. Sa tanto si BJ lo ke hoben niya mas ke guau. Ni pagod sa barabe finu English. The last I checked in Webster's, the term colonialism means control by one power over a dependent people or a dependent area. Colonialism is a policy that advocates or is based on this kind of control. The process and the continuation of colonization is dependent on one government or group of people imposing on another government or group of people the rules under which they live. I am so privileged to introduce this young man, si Julian I call him, an attorney who has done so much brilliant scholarship in the broader field of international human rights law. And within this, his work centers on self-determination, specifically as it concerns indigenous and colonized peoples, or the inhabitants of what the UN calls non-self-governing territories. Julian's work in this area has taken both legal and non-legal forms, including writing, activism, criticism, community organizing, and legal scholarship. He is also engaged in demilitarization work, which in Guam's case has been inextricably tied to decolonization and self-determination. Julian is a repeated guest lecturer at the UCLA School of Law. This year, within the next week, I believe, Julian will be traveling to receive his 2011 Petra Fellow, awarded by a New York-based Petra Foundation, a national foundation that honors individuals deemed to have made distinctive contributions toward advancing the rights, autonomy, and the dignity of others. We are so proud and fortunate to have Julian, Leevin, Therese, BJ. Please, let's give them a big hand of applause and welcome their testimony today.
Thank you very much, Auntie Hope, for that introduction. I will try to stay to my 7 to 8 minute limit. But I would like to start by admitting something, is I really did hesitate when I was first invited to be part of this series. After a series of events that have transpired since my presentation at the University of Guam last week. But I want to share this to illustrate a point that I basically, you could say I'm freshly reminded of how powerful words are. When I was giving my, what was really an academic legal lecture on the right of self-determination under international law, I recounted the evolution of the legal norm of self-determination in its post-World War II context as a principle that eventually became a crystallized right that became something that colonized peoples could quickly and clearly and formally wrap their movements around. This is a very dignified international legal norm, and the international jurisprudential literature around the right of self-determination is also filled with dignity. So when I came to the University of Guam last week, I really did endeavor to bring to the discourse and to bring to our community an elevated conversation that rightly casts the right of self-determination in a dignified light, the light that it deserves and enjoys under international law. And to my dismay, the presentation was wildly distorted, and there were a few people in the community who have chosen to torture the meaning and hollow out the definitions of even the words I used, and to create more misinformation and to taint the dignity with which I tried to do that presentation. So I want to say for the record that my presentation at the University of Guam last week really was an act of love, and if you watch it, it's available online. There was absolutely no call to armed violence in the presentation. There was merely a reference to a 1973 resolution that I was more or less paraphrasing. So I wanted to clear that up for anyone for whom that's a lingering concern. Now my presentation, I would like to speak quickly but clearly to the right to vote. So you can sort of say that I'm supplementing Vice Speaker Cruz's presentation with a bifurcate legal analysis. Because although I do specialize, I don't like the word expert. I think it creates distance between the expert and the people. I specialize in international law, but I am trained as an American law lawyer at an American legal institution, so I would like to bring to this presentation something different, both an analysis of the right to vote under U.S. constitutional law, as well as the right to vote in a self-determination vote specifically under international law. So that's the bifurcate treatment I'm going to give this analysis. Under the U.S. constitutional law, The basic challenge to the right to vote as it's framed in Guam popular discourse today is that to limit the electorate, that is, to limit the right to vote in Guam's future self-determination referendum to a specific class of people, politically defined as native inhabitants of Guam, who are made citizens by virtue of the passage and enactment of the 1950 Organic Act, so that's the political definition we're using, that to limit the constitutional legal challenge is that to limit the right to vote in such a fashion is unconstitutional race-based discrimination. It's violative of the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which has a very general blanket prohibition on racial discrimination in voting. So that is the nutshell of the constitutional legal challenge brought by American law-trained lawyers. So in 2000, you should remember this case. In 2000, there was a case heard by the U.S. Supreme Court called Rice versus Cayetano. And this case has been invoked with a level of passion that it still alarms me. Because there are American constitutional law trained lawyers who are determined to suggest that the case is so clear and that the case is unequivocal, and that the case boldly stands for the proposition that you cannot limit the right to vote along any ancestral or racial lines. So I want to make 3 subpoints with regard to this case, because this is the most important legally significant case that we're going to have to fully brief to challenge and win the constitutional legal challenge. The first issue is the issue of language. I started out as a writer, I still am a writer, so I believe in the power of words. And that case has a sentence: ancestry can be a proxy for race. It is that proxy here. That is the actual sentence from the U.S. Supreme Court case Rice v. Cayetano. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this case in 2000, but the facts briefly are as follows. In this case, a Caucasian rancher from Hawaii was denied the right to vote for OHA. That's an acronym. OHA is Office of Hawaiian Affairs. It's a Hawaii state agency that has a 5-fold mandate, which includes a legal obligation to provide services for those defined as either Native Hawaiian or Hawaiian. So I won't go into too much nuance, but you should know that the statutory definition at issue in the Rice versus Cayetano case made reference or defined Hawaiian as anyone with an ancestor that lived in the Hawaiian Islands in 1778 or before 1778. So the legal concern in that case, the date in that case was 1778. And I'm not sure how many of you are history buffs, but 1778 is legally significant for one reason. That is when the Hawaiian Islands made contact with the Western world. So I know this might be losing a few of you, but it's important, it really is important that we become precise and are able to respond to these challenges. So the Rice versus Cayetano case basically said that in that case, the white rancher who brought the lawsuit under the 15th Amendment won, because they said to deny him the right to vote for state trustees of a state agency in a state election was unconstitutional under the 15th Amendment. I'm going to point out quickly the 3 reasons why this case is very distinguishable. In other words, when I say distinguishable, that's what lawyers say when we say this case is not like this other case, and that's why it doesn't apply or control the Guam situation, and that's why our vote is not constitutional. The date in that case was 1778, and that is, the court said, if 1778 is the date, the legislative purpose must have been to insulate the race group, the group of Polynesians living in those islands, in a way along racial lines, because there was a logical impossibility that any Caucasian could have been there before 1778. So that's a huge difference. It's hugely different from the dates at issue in the Guam scenario, because here we have a 1950 Organic Act that references an 1898 residency, But if Guam's case was truly analogous to the Hawaii case, the date in question in Guam would be 1521. That's when Guam first made contact with the Western world. So that's the first thing you should say about how to distinguish the case. The second thing is to point out that the very nature of a self-determination vote is constitutive in nature. That means it's a political community rising up for the very first time wishing to constitute itself. It's a formational, constitutive, establishing act. This is so completely not similar to a vote for state public officials in a state election. So that should be your second go-to. You should say, no, not only is the date legally significant and it's not for a racial purpose, but, where was I on this one? Okay, yeah, but the nature of the self-determination vote is qualitatively different, and these things have a lot of legal significance. That's the second point. The third point is I was giving a presentation, and I would like to repeat here, that facts alone are easy enough to agree upon. But questions about values, about power, about legal imagination, about moral imagination, they're messier. They're inherently contested. So, but this is what self-determination, aside from the law, is about. It involves very important, complicated stuff. And so when you hear people talking about self-determination, it would be in your best interest to immediately be alarmed when people suggest that it is so simple, or that it's so clear, or that it's so obviously race-based discrimination. So what I've done in the first half is give you sort of legal responses to the constitutional law angle. Now I would like to transition and close with some commentary about international law. It's a common problem in the United States, as well as US-influenced areas such as Guam, to not reach for international law to help solve a problem that is clearly international in nature. And even if you're not willing to concede that it's entirely international in nature, you should at least consider that it has many international dimensions. And that is why I think it's always very important to lift our heads collectively out of the sand and look from a wider, step back and have a wider view. Because the world has actually spoken to some of these issues, and the world has collectively answered some of these issues. And this is the case I would like to end with. In 2002, there was a case involving, guess what? A right to self-determination in the colonial context. In this case, it was the colony of New Caledonia and its administering power, that is France. France had long, for many years, argued that to deny French citizens the right to vote in New Caledonia's self-determination referendum would be, 1, illegal under France's domestic constitution, and 2, illegal under international law's general rule against racial discrimination. In that case, and I think it's a wonderful case because it's illustrative of the fact that the international community is not very much particularly concerned whether the anticipated self-determination vote is unconstitutional under the colonizer's constitution. In that case, it became quite clear that the logic was, that's a little irrelevant. They didn't come out and say it, but they definitely adopted the reasoning that it is not an actually strong legal argument for the colonizer to try to invoke its own constitution to adjudge the legality or illegality of your anti-colonial struggle. Clearly, for political reasons, we can see the logic in that. It's not just the law. It should be quite clear as a political matter. But the second thing, and the last thing I will say about the case, is that it stands for a proposition that's very useful to the people of Guam. And that is, under international law, and that is under the law agreed upon more or less by more than 190 countries on earth, that the right to self-determination can coexist with the general rule that prohibits racial discrimination, because they're two qualitatively different legal norms at issue, and there is no actual irreconcilability to this. And that is one thing I'd like to end just on a deeper note. I think when people come to this conversation and they're very aggressive and they choose to try to, one, say it's so simple and so clear, and two, try to force you to use the least amount of weaponry possible in your fight, I think that's something to avoid assiduously. To say, perhaps, if I'm going to enter a debate or a struggle or a movement or a courtroom, I should actually use every legal tool I can to advance my propositions. And that is, I think, the main thing I wanted to say.
Wow, right? How about another hand of applause for such fine, intelligent panel? I know we have several requests, and I'm going to repeat the request that Senator Hope has made earlier, because people are asking, and I can understand why. But we really would like the speakers at this panel to please provide a copy of their presentation. All speeches will be made available, and so in its entire session. So again, you're going to be quotables. The reason, I mean, don't you like that? That they're going to be quoting you, with authority. And so, yeah, very great. It's unfortunate that the time has not allowed us to do any questions and answers, but that the panel will remain seated for the closing remarks. But you are all welcome, all of you here, to please, just when you have questions for the panel, that they're going to be available to answer any of your questions. It is, wow, what a great day, huh, Senator Hope? Yes, it is such a, making history and getting this conversation going is just timely, and we appreciate all the attendance and the efforts of Speaker Wampet and the members of the Guam Legislature. It is an honor and also a great privilege for us to introduce the Majority Leader who's going to do the closing remarks. Senator Rory J. Respicio has served in the Guam Legislature since the 27th term. Currently, he serves as the Majority Leader and Chairperson of the Committee on Rules, Federal Foreign and Micronesian Affairs, and Human and Natural Resources. He previously served as Senior Staff Member of the Office of the Governor and as Director of the Department of Youth Affairs.
The Honorable Respicio, Senator Respicio, received his Bachelor of Science degree in Government and Politics with a minor in English Business Management, and he wants me to roll on. And he also served as a youth member for the Commission on Self-Determination, the predecessor of the current Commission on Decolonization, which he sits in as a vice chairperson. Let us welcome him.
Thank you. Let's also give these two senators a big round of applause for being excellent facilitators. I think wow is the word that best describes the presentations made by our legal scholars, but also a word that describes how productive and fruitful this entire conference was, this forum was. And Speaker and I were talking, and we noticed every time the senators here asked you for copies of your speech, your presentation, we know that because it was given with such passion, including the speech by Attorney Terlaje, although she had some prepared remarks, she barely read from those remarks. And so we're going to do you a favor, just as you've done us a favor. We're going to instruct the clerk to transcribe your comments. We know how busy you are, so we will take care of that. But First, let me congratulate Speaker Judith Wampad and all of those responsible for organizing this Guam's Quest for Decolonization Forum, as well as all of you who participated in today's forum. I'm pleased with this valuable exchange of information about the legal and historical background of Guam's quest for decolonization, and we hope today's discourse contributes to the re-energizing of the public knowledge, discussion, and action of this very important issue. The process of exercising our right to self-determination is critically important for the future of our island and our people, and it involves our entire community. The greater number of us who take an active interest to educate ourselves and learn about this process, then the greater there will be in the achievements on the long road to finally securing a just political status for our people. And Julian, we know that this process is not at all easy, and we appreciate everyone that's been involved in this effort over the last decades. And all of us have a stake in this outcome, and sadly, many people have since passed on, including political and community leaders like former Speaker Carlos Taitno, whose account of the Guam walkout fascinates us until this very day. Let us please pause for a moment of silence to reflect on all of our heroes who, like us, have yet to be given the right to freely express the political status of our own choosing. You know, ladies and gentlemen, our problems as an island government are a result of our present federal-territorial relationship, and we must familiarize ourselves with the quest of the Chamorro people to ultimately be freed from the political shackles of colonial powers. There is no greater right for a human being than to decide his or her own destiny, and for the Chamorro people, that can only occur through a process of self-determination and decolonization. This must be our unified message. Many of our young people are involved in the next event being planned as part of this series of educational forums, and which will be held in the coming months. This is a very good thing, and this theme of this event is Decidi Pago, I Decide, and it is being organized under the auspices of this legislature, specifically the Public Policy Institute, a youth internship program under Speaker Wampad and Will Castro's tutelage, the 28th Guam Youth Congress, and the UOG Student Government Association. The spotlight will focus on those important historical events in our people's long journey toward the goal of decolonization, and history tells us that the Chamorro people began as a free people with a society and a language of our own creation. But for hundreds of years now, we have had other societies and other languages and other forms of government imposed upon us, telling us how to live, enacting laws for which we have no say, going against the very idea that government gets its power from the consent of the people, as Dr. Robert Underwood so eloquently articulated. We must make this decision now more than ever. We must be allowed the opportunity to determine our own destiny. That time is long overdue for the Chamorro people. We must continue to move toward a process for decolonization, no matter what that status may be, whatever status is chosen by the majority, and work in a unified Team Guam approach to Congress and the United Nations, putting our individual aspirations aside and instead putting Guam first. Many thanks to all of you for your participation and attendance in today's forum, and we look forward to seeing you at the upcoming events. And before we close, we'd like to extend another undangkron asidus masi to our panelists, Dr. Robert Underwood, former Congressman and President of the University of Guam, to Vice Speaker, the Honorable former Chief Justice, who thankfully you've been around all this time to remind us of what we've done or have not done. Vice Speaker BJ Cruz, Attorney Therese Terlaje, who also is our legislative counsel, to which we've been very privileged to have her legal guidance here, to Attorney Julian Aguon and Attorney Leevin Camacho, wow again, and especially to our off-island guest, Dr. Carlisle Corbin. Thank you, and si Diyos masi.
The speaker has also announced that this is just the first of several forums that the legislature is going to be doing. And so tune in to announcements. I believe that the next session is slated in January, and there will be the historical perspectives, and then there will be I believe, a panel for inviting all of those who actually participated in the formulation of their covenants and their compacts. And not the present leaders, but those who actually were in active negotiations when they developed their covenants and their compacts. And there is going to be future symposiums on just an ongoing discourse and discussion. Senator Hope, do you have a closing remark?
Basically, we wanted to thank KUAM for live streaming this session today and for making it available to everyone on island. Si Diyos masi KUAM.
Si Diyos masi.